Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this live coverage of the much-anticipated fight between the undisputed heavyweight world champion USA and its challenger, China.
That's right, Martin. The U.S. has dominated the economic landscape over the past 50 years with an economy now at roughly $20 trillion. But in the last 4 decades, China has experienced significant growth, making them the second largest with an economy of around $14 trillion. Let's quickly take a look at this rise. Under Deng Xiaoping's leadership in the 80s, China moved from a centralized, planned economy to a more market-oriented model, promoting private ownership in selected industries. The establishment of special economic zones and the opening of coastal cities attracted significant foreign investment by offering incentives like tax breaks and low-cost utilities, which led to a higher degree of technology transfer and industrial growth. Additionally, leveraging its large, low-cost labor force, China focused on labor-intensive manufacturing and export-led growth, which made their share of foreign trade to GDP jumping from 14% in 1978 to 70% in 2006. But what really was the turning point was China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001. 9 years down the road, China replaced Japan as the second largest economy on Earth, and in recent years they have launched several economic initiatives, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and Made in China 2025. And this has made the U.S. raise their eyebrows.
And rightfully so, Alan. The Chinese have surely put their nose on the grindstone here. However, it's been a long time since we've seen a proper economic heavyweight fight. The reason for this, however, is mainly the creation of the previously mentioned World Trade Organization, WTO, in 1995. Prior to this, the U.S. was a fond user of the so-called Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, in which they acted as the police force, prosecutor, jury, and judge in Earth's trading ecosystem. This is a law the U.S. used to pressure countries to open their markets when they limit access for American exporters. It allows the U.S. to independently impose tariffs on a foreign country's exports or restrict its access to the U.S. market. And tariff is truly a key word for this fight. A tariff is a tax that a government charges on goods that are imported from another country. When a country places a tariff on foreign goods, it makes those goods more expensive to buy within that country. This is often done to encourage people to buy products made locally instead of imported ones, and to give local businesses an advantage over foreign competitors. This is what we saw in an earlier heavyweight fight between the U.S. and Japan during the 80s, when the U.S. threatened with aggressive tariffs on Japanese exports to the U.S., especially electronic products. As Japan was heavily reliant on such trade with the U.S., this threat worked as a weapon to hinder Japan's leading position in the semiconductor market, which was a hot topic during the 80s. However, the policy has hardly been used in recent decades and is generally considered an unfair strategy after the World Trade Organization was established in 1995. But now the U.S. is back at it, and it's China's turn to put on their gloves. Assessing the situation, it appears to be a kind of voluntary defense match, with the U.S. eyeing China as a challenger to its championship title. But according to the U.S., China has over time used unfair trade practices and various dirty tricks, which leaves the U.S. no choice but to meet the Chinese in the ring. But let's talk a bit about that, Alan. What does the U.S. mean about unfair trading practices? Why are they starting this fight now?
Well, the U.S. government has for a long time criticized various aspects of China's trading policies. We saw some minor tariffs on Chinese textiles being placed by the administrations of George Bush and Barack Obama, but nothing big enough to stir up a fight. It wasn't until President Donald Trump was elected in 2016 that things got interesting. Trump has since the 1980s advocated tariffs on Chinese exports, claiming that the U.S. has been ripped off by China. These accusations stem from the fact that the U.S. has a huge trade deficit with China. Simply put, this means that the U.S. import more goods and services from China than they export. In fact, the U.S. has been running a significant trade deficit with the world since 1976, and China makes up the largest portion. In 2017, the U.S. trade deficit amounted to $566 billion, with their trade deficit with China making up $375 billion.
So, what's the problem with this? Why is it so bad to have a trade deficit?
Well, it isn't necessarily entirely good or entirely bad, but the politicians surely don't like it. The downsides are that the U.S. economy is then heavily influenced by factors such as exchange rates, trade policies, and global economic conditions. However, the main concern is that a trade deficit may harm domestic industries, reduce employment, and slow economic growth. And this is what President Trump is concerned about. He argues that by imposing tariffs on Chinese imports, it'll bring more manufacturing jobs back to the U.S., as the trade deficit reflects a situation where the U.S. relied too heavily on a workforce abroad. However, economists are unsure whether tariffs are the solution to this issue. The problem lies in the U.S. running massive budget deficits, which means that the government spends more money than it gets in from taxes, duties, fines, and other fees. By suppressing domestic savings, the U.S. forces themselves to import surplus savings from abroad. Economists are worried that by starting a trade war with China, this will only change trade patterns in which U.S. will get a similar deficit with other countries instead, and these are countries with higher cost producers than China, which doesn't seem to benefit the U.S.
But let's not be too harsh on the heavyweight champion now, Alan. One thing is complaining about the trade deficit itself, but don't they have some arguments related to China's trade policies that are more justified?
Sure, Martin, that's true. After the Second World War, we saw that Japan relied heavily on foreign technologies. China has had a similar strategy of development, focusing on enhancing domestic technology by learning from foreign countries. A common strategy here is that China demands foreign companies to form partnerships with Chinese companies, often requiring them to sign over their intellectual property and technology. The U.S. therefore claims China to steal U.S. technology, as this forced technology transfer is an unwritten rule that applies when a U.S. company wants to do business in China. The U.S. even issued a report estimating how much this IP theft cost them. The estimates were between $225 billion and $600 billion annually. The Chinese, on the other hand, say that this obviously isn't true and that it's pure speculation. However, studies have shown that Chinese companies and U.S. partnerships often made the most technological advancement and innovations.
But Alan, I just have to ask, maybe it's just me being stupid here, but what if the U.S. succeed in achieving this, meaning that U.S. companies operating in China don't have to worry about IP thefts? This sounds to me like it makes it easier for American corporations to expand their operations overseas, a move that often involves replacing U.S. workers with lower-cost foreign labor. The precise opposite of what Trump says he wants to achieve.
That's a good point, Martin. I'm not sure what their endgame is on that issue. Anyways, another thing that has fired up the Americans is the fact that China has a long history of facilitating an undervalued currency by intervening in the foreign exchange market. This is done to give its manufacturers an advantage when selling goods to the U.S. In addition to this, the U.S. accuses China of dumping products in the U.S. market, meaning selling a product below its cost price, as well as utilizing an unfair amount of subsidizing. The U.S. argues that the sum of all these factors makes it impossible for other countries to compete in the market.
Right, so these are the dirty tricks the Americans refer to?
I mean, you could go on endlessly about all these accusations and crafty moves, but at its core, it's really about the U.S. fearing the loss of its championship title, both in terms of economic and geopolitical dominance.
But what about the Chinese? What do they want?
The Chinese seem to be more skeptical about this fight. A Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson recently stated that there is no future and no winner in a trade war, and both sides will be the losers. However, Beijing and Xi Jinping aren't backing down. They've made it clear that if Washington starts swinging, they're not just going to stand there and take the hit. They're ready to throw punches of their own.
I'm going to have to cut you off there, Alan. I've just got word in my ear. Geoff is down on Earth with a live update. Let's go straight to him.
Thanks, guys. Yes, it sure is getting tense down here. I think there are some mind games going on at the moment. When Trump was running for president in 2016, he was quite clear in his message.
We can't continue to allow China to rape our country, and that's what they're doing. It's the greatest theft in the history of the world.
But then the vibe changed.
So this is your original form very much, yeah, it really is. 这是原来的文化。对，就我们这些人也是原来的人。
And people like we call ourselves the inheritance people going down from dragon. The sons and daughters of dragons.
That's great.
And then it changed again. Perhaps it was China's self-image as the dragon that ruffled Trump's feathers.
I am the first president ever to challenge China on trade.
But I've made clear our trade imbalance is just not acceptable. China's market distortions and the way they deal cannot be tolerated. We will no longer tolerate such abuse.
The Chinese seem to maintain a more neutral tone.
There's no point in blaming globalization for the world's problems. as that is simply not the case, and it will not help solve these problems.
方绝不会做事。
China will not sit idly by while legitimate rights and interests are hurt. We must take all necessary measures to firmly defend our rights and interests.
The latest is that Trump said that this will be an easy win and won't have it that their competitors are getting cute. Exciting times ahead, boys.
Cheers, Geoff. We're closing in on the action now. What's the latest movements, Ellen?
Both fighters have started to flex their muscles. The U.S. has implemented global safeguard tariffs on all solar panel imports worth $8.5 billion and on all washing machine imports worth $1.8 billion. They also impose a 25% tariff on all steel imports and a 10% tariff on all aluminum imports. With some exceptions, these tariffs hit globally, and China answers by imposing tariffs ranging from 15 to 25% on 128 different products. The U.S. then published a list of 1,334 proposed products subject to a potential 25% tariff. China counters with their own list of 106 products, but what's happening now? Are they getting cold feet, or is it another mind game play? China and U.S. are having trade talks in Beijing. Do they want to put the fight on hold?
No, look, Alan, no agreement in sight. It seems both fighters are only fine-tuning their technique now. Washington's adjusting its product list, and Beijing's following suit. Both contenders are officially in the ring.
The first round is underway.
The U.S. goes right off the bat with a solid jab by materializing the 25% tariff on their finalized list of 818 imported Chinese products, which is valued at $34 billion. But the Chinese take the jab honorably and counters with the exact same attack by materializing the 25% tariff on their own list of 545 goods from the U.S., also valued at $34 billion. This includes agriculture products such as soybeans, which is one of U.S.'s weak spots. The Americans already start cooking up new lists of products. They release and initiates a 25% tariff on their second list, an additional 284 Chinese products worth $16 billion. And not only that, but they released a third list of products worth $200 billion that they say will be hit with a 10% tariff. Relentless moves by the U.S. right from the opening bell. However, the Chinese accepts the dance and responds by applying 25% tariffs on an equal amount of $16 billion. China keeps mirroring the U.S.'s moves. Let's hear from Geoff.
It's getting dirty way earlier than I thought. The local U.S. soybean farmers are getting worried about the situation.
I mean, I do like the regulation side of things and the way he's backing things off, but just the same, these areas of trade are very important to agriculture. We can't interrupt this.
The U.S. opened with such force that China was left with no choice but to respond just as aggressively. Beijing's last tariff list included Harley-Davidson, bourbon, and orange juice. We're already seeing a full-blown slugfest in the ring.
Cheers, Geoff. Stay safe down there. It seems that China is calling a foul on one of U.S.'s hits. They consult the referee and files WTO claims against the U.S. for its tariffs on solar panels. Interesting. But this doesn't bother the U.S. as they now implement their third round of tariffs, namely their List 3, 10% on goods worth $200 billion, which will increase to 25% in 2019. Absolute menace. China responds to this by implementing tariffs on $60 billion US dollars worth of U.S. goods. This is getting out of hand. They're both using almost all their energy in the first round. U.S. is even threatening to impose tariffs on the remaining goods imported from China, which is roughly estimated to be $257 billion.
But look, Martin, something's happening. It seems that both countries suddenly cooled down and realized they were overzealous.
Well, that took a sudden turn. Look at that. Both parties have agreed to a temporary truce to de-escalate trade tensions. And there goes the bell for the first round. What a start.
An unbelievable first round, and what an ending. The agreement right before the bell said that both the U.S. and China will refrain from increasing tariffs or imposing new tariffs until March 2019 as they work towards a larger trade deal. However, this sudden shift only makes sense as both sides suffered in the first round. Trump and Xi seemed to abruptly gain clarity after their initial adrenaline rush faded. The Americans experience that the tariff costs are being paid by U.S. companies as they have to accept lower profit margins, eventually cutting wages and jobs for U.S. workers and ultimately rise prices for American consumers and companies. It seems like replacing foreign workforce doesn't happen overnight. Also, across the U.S., a lot of farmers got bankrupted following the retaliation of Chinese tariffs on soybeans, wheat, and sorghum. Ironically, the U.S.'s trade deficit with China has never been higher, reaching a new record of $419 billion in 2018, up from $375 billion in 2017. As for China, Chinese exporters struggled to adjust their prices and weren't able to swiftly find new markets for their products, resulting in decreased sales and profitability. This fight hasn't benefited either, and a larger trade deal seems to be the only reasonable approach now.
The bell rings for round two, a totally different start to this round. The fighters are taking a cautious approach, feeling each other out with trade talks happening in both Beijing and Washington. Apparently, they're making some progress, agreeing to purchase various products from each other and set temporary reductions for different tariffs. The parties have now agreed to a deadline extension as the negotiations drag on. Let's hear from Geoff down on the sideline.
That's right. The deadline is extended, but they won't say how long. China just banned all types of fentanyl distribution to the U.S. This has been a sensitive topic for the U.S. given their opioid crisis, so I think the Americans appreciated that gesture from their fellow Earthlings. The parties continue with their trade talks, but something's fishy. It's really more of a psychological game than a physical one at this point.
Cheers, Geoff. And look at that, Geoff knows when something's fishy. It seems that Washington is getting tired of these negotiations and is now increasing tariffs on their List 3 goods worth of $200 billion from 10% to 25%. Trump also threatens to impose tariffs on all remaining imports from China. He says that this is because the Chinese are trying to renegotiate the trade deal they initially agreed upon. Tensions are back up, Ellen.
That's right. China responds with their own new tariffs, but the U.S. won't have it. They now sniper out specific companies and adds Huawei to their so-called entity list, meaning that U.S. companies are not allowed to sell products to the Chinese telecommunications company without U.S. government approval. A change in tactics, it seems, but as we've seen earlier in the fight, China mirrors the U.S.'s move, creating its own unreliable entities list, 1-1.
But now the trade negotiations are back on and various tariffs are being withheld. This is getting ridiculous. It seems to me that neither of the two really want to keep going, but at the same time, they don't want to show weakness.
A good old dick measuring contest.
Damn right, Alan. Well, it's back and forth now. Washington just declared China a currency manipulator after the yuan sunk to 7 against the U.S. dollar, its lowest level in 11 years. But the International Monetary Fund rejects the accusation. A hit and a miss. Washington then returned to their usual strategy and hits the Chinese with new tariffs on an additional $125 billion. The Chinese quickly sends a jab back by increasing some of their existing tariffs. Behind the scenes, the Chinese have now filed 3 lawsuits to the World Trade Organization challenging U.S. tariffs against Chinese imports. The fighters are clearly worn out now. Trade talks come and go, with both sides occasionally easing up on tariffs. And there comes the second round to an end.
Yeah, not much to say about this one. I think we got spoiled with the first round there. While there were a few solid punches, nothing really stood out. In fact, at times, it was almost embarrassing to watch. But hear this, Martin, during the round, China lowered tariffs for other countries like Canada, Japan, and Germany, giving them far better access to its 1.4 billion consumers. A sharp contrast to Washington's approach of handing out tariff penalties left, right, and center. On the other hand, the U.S.-China trade deficit fell for the first time in 6 years, now at $346 billion, following the heavy taxations, but the countries are still hurting internally. It is reported that the American manufacturing sector has fell into its deepest slump in over a decade. Figures for China shows that their 2019 economic growth rate has fallen amid the trade war to a 30-year low. Based on the trade talks at the end of the round, we're expecting a deal to be made early on in the next round, and there goes the bell.
And as ordered, there comes the deal, the long-awaited Phase 1 deal. Most importantly, this deal will cut tariffs both ways and boost China's purchases of U.S. goods, in which the Chinese agreed to purchase $200 billion of additional U.S. exports within the next 2 years. The deal also touches upon topics such as intellectual property protection and enforcement. Additionally, the U.S. says they will stop calling China a currency manipulator. A big relief for the Chinese, as nobody likes being called such names. Oh, looks like we've gotten an emergency call from Geoff.
Breaking news, guys!
The fuck are you wearing, Geoff?
Well, Martin, a certain virus, whose name I'll respectfully avoid, has thrown Earth into quite a frenzy. Call it a bit of hysteria, but it's undoubtedly disrupted global trade. And those ambitious targets set in the trade deal, they're looking even less achievable now. The U.S. granted exemptions on tariffs related to various types of medical equipment due to this situation. But despite all this, we see that China has risen to yet again become the U.S.'s #1 trading partner.
Cheers, Geoff. What's happening now, Alan?
Both parties are feeling each other out, seeing if the other is still committed to the trade deal. We're noting a growing concern from the U.S. regarding China's military. They're specifically imposing restrictions on China's largest chipmaker, SMIC, as Washington views the equipment sold to SMIC as an unacceptable risk with potential military applications. Trump also imposes new export controls, namely banning sales of specific American semiconductor software and manufacturing equipment to Chinese companies, especially Huawei. And not only that, but President Trump just signed an executive order prohibiting Americans from investing in shares of companies with ties to the Chinese military. A move meant to prevent Chinese military access to American dollars, but it turns out that also the U.S. investors have taken a major hit following the action.
I have to interrupt you again, Alan. We're getting another call from Geoff.
This seems to be the round of rarities. The Americans are doing a tag team. Donald Trump tags in Joe Biden as their next president. It's clear that Trump was not at all happy about the swap, as he felt he was doing a good job, but it seems that the crowd wasn't having it and wanted a change.
Cheers, Geoff. And that's the last thing that happened this round, because there goes the bell.
A round driven by external factors. What's interesting to see is how bad the trade deal turned out. U.S. exports of Phase 1 goods in 2020 fell more than 40% short of the target, and much of the deal has been deemed a failure.
But, Alan, why did the Americans tag in Joe Biden? How much was it related to the trade war?
That's a tough question, but it definitely had some impact. When Trump introduced U.S. tariffs, it rallied support by stirring up nationalism and framing the move as standing up to a bully. But once China struck back with its own tariffs, it wasn't that much fun anymore. However, it's impossible to explain the election based on one specific cause.
Well, right, let's see what Biden has to offer in the ring. Is he backing out? Will we see a knockout? Will we see a truce? Let's see. Round 4 is underway, and here he comes. I wouldn't quite say he's floating like a butterfly, but then again, never count old Joe out. He just might have a few tricks up his sleeve. He seems to have a reasonable approach to his takeover. The new administration spends a lot of the time reviewing the legacy of Trump and calibrate their strategy. The Chinese remain silent, awaiting Washington's next move. Whoa, look at that. Biden confirms he will not reverse the tariffs placed by Trump.
Interesting to see. A lot of speculation whether the new team would ease down on the tariffs, especially given the fact that the American business community wants them removed as companies struggle with inflation and supply chain disruption. So Biden argues that the Chinese aren't meeting the commitments they promised in the Phase 1 deal. Hence, he doesn't feel he's in a position where he can lift tariffs.
Right, and speaking of Phase 1 deal, Biden says that he will still enforce the deal in order to put pressure on China to hold up their end of the bargain, probably also to show that this guy means business as well. Another thing Biden makes perfectly clear is that he will move away from Trump's brash, go-it-alone rhetoric and instead try to re-engage allies that had been insulted by Trump. Geoff sits with more insight down on Earth. Let's hear from him.
The days of tariff announcements on Twitter are gone, boys. It's a whole new playing field. All eyes are on the U.S. now, with President Xi watching closely to see Biden's next move. And not only Xi, but the whole world. As you said, Biden is brushing dust of old friendships, and it seems to be going just fine. But creating alliances is only part of Washington's new strategy. This trade war is developing into something more political, it seems. From an American point of view, it's a growing concern that China is weaponizing its economic development. People no longer talk about tariffs and trade deficits. Technology is what's on everybody's lips now.
Cheers, Geoff. And now we see that Washington is getting busy. The Biden administration implements 2 acts called the Chips for America Act and Inflation Reduction Act, both with the focus on breaking U.S. reliance on China. The former aims to heavily subsidize the American semiconductor production with tens of billions of dollars. The latter mainly focus on tax rewards to the American clean energy industry. It's funny to see. What is said to provoke the Americans in the first place was China's Made in China 2025 strategy, which focused on heavy state subsidies to various industries. And now the U.S. is playing the same hand. But Washington is now going mayhem here. They just announced new export controls on artificial intelligence and semiconductor technology to China. This blocks leading U.S. AI computer chip designers such as NVIDIA and AMD from selling their high-end chips to China. The U.S. is now strangling large segments of the Chinese technology industry, strangling with an intent to kill. And there the 4th round comes to an end.
The fight is truly back on, but on a whole other level. In this round, it was mainly the U.S. throwing punches, and heavy ones at that. What we're seeing here is a 3-part strategy from the Americans. At first, they started making alliances, basically saying to Europe, If you think that being reliant on Russia for energy is dangerous, imagine digital dependence on China over the long term. Then they started on their Ending Reliance on China initiative, which was the two acts aiming at running faster than the Chinese. And finally, their third and most ruthless punch, cracking down on China's technological development. Rather than targeting software, the export controls choke off China's access to the advanced and crucial computer chip hardware that powers AI and various other technologies. It's Beijing's turn now. The world awaits to see what they will do to retaliate against Washington's actions.
The final round is underway. Before we get to see any counterattack from China, there are two key announcements that are made. When the U.S. introduced their export controls towards China, they took a major diplomatic gamble. By simply blocking all U.S. chips to China, they risked the possibility of other countries to come in and replace the supply. And by other countries, we are mainly talking about Japan, the Netherlands, and Taiwan. Walk us through this, Alan.
That's right, Martin. The high-tech chip-making industry is highly centralized. Taiwan produces more than 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductor computer chips. A single company based in Netherlands called ASML produces 100% of the most advanced lithography machines that are irreplaceable equipment for computer chip factories. Together, the U.S., Japan, and the Netherlands provide roughly 90% of all the equipment that is used in computer chip factories worldwide. In 2022, Taiwan was the first to join in on imposing export controls on chips to China. Taiwan has strong reasons to back Washington. Biden has been more vocal than any recent president about defending Taiwan, and the Taiwanese semiconductor industry has suffered from Chinese-backed espionage and talent poaching. As for the Netherlands and Japan, that's the announcements that just came in. They are now also adopting new export controls on advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment. This fight is turning more into China versus the world.
Why is everyone turning against China?
Well, Europe's view on China has taken a negative turn over the past 5 years, not only due to age-old concerns about human rights and so-called economic balance, but Beijing's support for Moscow after the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine has angered Europe.
Here comes China's response. They made it clear that they won't just swallow this one. They counter with three targeted moves. Firstly, they have blocked all corporate mergers involving a U.S. semiconductor company that operates in Chinese markets. As corporate mergers are critical for business development in this industry, this is a solid punch. Second, they banned purchases of Micron chips, the leading U.S. producer of memory chips in China's critical infrastructure sector, which is one of Micron's biggest markets. Thirdly, they introduced export controls on gallium and germanium, two minerals that are important raw inputs for electronics manufacturing. Although these aren't as critical for the West as the West's export controls are for China, it is still showing that President Xi still has some muscle left.
Just a quick comment on what you said there. The reason why U.S. and its allies' export controls are so damaging to China is the fact that China is way behind their competitors in the semiconductor supply chain, and it is said that with these export controls adequately enforced, it might add a decade or two for China's plans for semiconductor self-sufficiency. The U.S. has major concerns about China's advancements in three critical areas: semiconductors, biotechnology, and clean energy, each essential to future tech and defense capabilities. Currently, the U.S. and its allies hold a strong position in semiconductors, which is what they are strategically leveraging.
And there, ladies and gentlemen, our live coverage of this fight has come to an end. But it has developed and is still developing into something even bigger. What started as tariff jabs eventually evolved into a full-on tech war between the two giants, in which external parties joined in, whilst the U.S. are minding China's business and disrupting their development in fear of economic and geopolitical expansion. China fights off the best they can and don't quite understand why the U.S. just won't mind their own business. The U.S. is moving from decades of optimism about global tech integration toward a policy aimed at securing critical technologies, like semiconductors, within its own borders. This shift not only targets economic benefits, but also addresses national security concerns, as there's increased worry that China's tech advancements could potentially be weaponized. The tariffs are still in place, and some have even increased later on. It seems that nobody cares about the trade deficit anymore, although some Americans have pointed out that the Chinese exports to the U.S. is what funds China's development, and should therefore be cut even harder. For old time's sake, Alan, what's the trade deficit now?
In 2023, the trade deficit between the U.S. and China was at its lowest in the past 10 years of $279 billion. Overall, however, the trade war has hurt both nations internally in terms of inflation, job losses, and disruptions in supply chains.
I'm sorry, Alan, but I think this is the last time I will interrupt you. Geoff is down on Earth with some groundbreaking news.
I can't believe my own eyes, boys. Right after the final round of our coverage, the U.S. performed a double tag substitute. Biden used to be a tough cookie, and I thought he would stay on. But we had to eat our own words and count old Joe out after all. The gloves were handed to Kamala Harris, who came in for a short period and said some words.
I grew up a middle-class kid. To see what can be unburdened by what has been.
Then guess what? Old Trump was then tagged back in. I think we're witnessing a back-to-back fight immediately here, but what will it be? Will we see the old warfare strategies of Trump with new tariffs and trade deficit talks? How will the tech war evolve? One thing is sure, Trump loves his tariffs.
The third most beautiful word is the word tariff.
And during his campaign, he promised to impose across-the-board tariffs on foreign imports from China. So I think we're in for a new trade war. Buckle up, boys.
Cheers, Geoff.